This week we're going to go to a book of the Bible that I've not seen regularly feature in the normal run of things. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And whenever we read the Bible, we learnt this in the Bible course, didn't we, a few weeks back? And it's important to remember that whenever we read the Bible, we need to know what it is that we're reading. And when we come to Ecclesiastes, we're reading wisdom. We're reading what they would have called the wisdom literature. It's an unusual book of the Bible. It's probably unique in the kind of sense that you get from the book of Ecclesiastes. Ancient wisdom literature wasn't the stuff of the instruction manual that you might get with your furniture. It wasn't even like the self-help books that you get today. What we would describe as wisdom would be something like a self-help book, wouldn't it? This is the manual. This is how to make yourself feel better. Ancient wisdom literature was put across in poetry and in art, and it was the sharing of the heart as well as the head. In ancient wisdom, and I think this is very wise, much wiser than our view nowadays, ancient wisdom always included an equal dose of heart and head. It was often led by the emotions. It was often led by our responses to life as it comes at us. In Ecclesiastes is one of those books. It's King Solomon sharing his heart as he responds to life as it comes at him. And so we need to learn from that, don't we, that this incredibly wise man gives us this heart-wrenching view of life in this book. I don't know if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, but I'm pretty sure Bob Dylan knows it very well. And if you don't know who Bob Dylan is, that's your homework. Go and listen to some of his songs, and you can find the themes of Ecclesiastes in Bob Dylan, or if you want something a little bit more modern, Morrissey. But even he's ancient now, isn't he? I don't know who's doing it nowadays. It's something that our culture's only recently discovering, I think. About 100 years ago, we started to teach our children, didn't we? It started to creep in at least 100 years ago, and now it's very popular in the education system. There is no God, or if there is, we don't need him anyway, so he's either dead or he's as good as dead, and we can get on with life without him. But then there's been a reaction in Western culture to that probably started in the 1960s and 70s, where people like Bob Dylan were representing it in modern culture, in pop culture, that actually we were looking at life, and a generation was growing up, and another generation growing up, and another generation growing up, looking at life without God and saying, this is absolutely rubbish. I mean, if this is all that there is, it's awful. And we started to bring generation after generation up to say, no, look, child, it's all about you. I'm going to liberate you from the reality of who God is. I'm going to liberate you from the tyranny of having a God up there who expects certain things of you in your life. And I'm going to say, put you in the center. I'm going to say, kid, it's all about you. You get to define what happiness is. You get to define what right and wrong is. And if it doesn't hurt anybody else, who gets to tell you anyway? And we had this view that we were liberating the next generation from the idea, the tyranny of a God. And then those generations have increasingly said, wow, this is some empty stuff you're teaching us. And that's what Ecclesiastes is all about. If you want to know what the angst is of the next rising generation, and why the things that are happening in our culture, in our society, are falling down, read Ecclesiastes as the experience of what it is to live without an understanding of God in the world. That's what Ecclesiastes is. So I'm going to read the first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes. But we're going to go to other places in the book as well. This is a taster of the book. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Israel. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north, round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. Yet what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. That's pretty bleak, isn't it? Pretty desperate. When I read that, it reminds me of a song I used to love when I was a teenager growing up. I was into all that depressing stuff. And there was a song by Delamitri called Nothing Ever Happens, which is a wonderful thing to celebrate, isn't it? And maybe some of you remember it was released at the end, like 89, I think. And the first verse goes like this: post office clerks put up signs saying position closed, and secretaries turn off typewriters and put on their coats, and janitors padlock the gates for security guards to patrol, and bachelors phone up their friends for a drink while the married ones turn on a chat show, and we'll all be lonely tonight and lonely tomorrow. And then the chorus goes, nothing ever happens. Nothing happens at all. The needle returns to the start of the song, and we all sing along like before, and we'll all be lonely tonight and lonely tomorrow. Same lonely truth. Nothing ever happens. And as I said before we read it, this is a growing theme that's coming out in popular culture, and I identify it as one way of saying that this is a bit of a problem that's growing up in our culture. And it's getting worse with each generation that goes by. And who knew that 3,000 years ago, a wise person had already written this down in the Word of God and said, by the way, when you hit this, I'm already here. We have a wonderful God, don't we, who's inspired this wonderful word. And we find that wherever we go in life and wherever we turn in life, God's already there. And he's already saying, oh, I know about that. Maybe we often bypass books of the Bible like Ecclesiastes because they seem so bleak and they don't seem to match what we want to encourage people towards. But a book like Ecclesiastes is gold to a generation, the generations that are growing up in our current education system, being taught that there is no God. So what can we learn from this chapter? The first thing that we can learn is that this is written by King Solomon. It seems likely that it's King Solomon, the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. And so that fits Solomon very, very accurately. And there's lots of other, as you go through the book, there's lots of other indications that this is King Solomon that's writing this. And the theme is life is meaningless. That theme goes all the way through the book of Ecclesiastes. It's repeated over and over again. It's a theme that goes round and round in circles, just as we have life being described as going round in apparently pointless cycles here in these verses that we've read. And when he says the word in verse 2, the word meaningless is difficult to translate, but it's something like a puff of air. And actually, some scholars will say, or increasing numbers of scholars will say, it's actually the kind of puff of air that's generated by the biological processes of a mammal's body. It's the breaking of wind. Utterly meaningless. Just hot air. That's all life is. That's how Solomon starts us off. 36 times he says it. And as you go through the book of Ecclesiastes, you find Solomon surveying all that life has to offer. And 36 times he comes back and says, it's just last night's indigestion. That's all it is. This journal of a desperate man, we're all just a burp in the breeze. Are you glad you came this morning? In the average lifetime, a human being consumes 854 tins of baked beans. And you know about beans, don't you? The more you eat. And the writer of Ecclesiastes says, is there any more than that? And then he goes on to describe it. I mean, there's 12 chapters of this stuff. I hope you're glad that I decided to do less than one chapter this morning. He says, look, we're all just prisoners of time and space. We're just in this like goldfish bowl that just goes round and round inevitably. There's nothing that we can do about it. We're hamsters on a wheel, goldfish on a bowl that just swim backwards and forwards, swimming round and round because there's literally nothing else to do. You get to the glass, you bump your nose on it, you turn round and you swim back again. Verse 3, at the end, what do people gain from all their labour under the sun? We do all this work and then what? Verse 6, verse 5 and 6, this going round and round, the sun rises and the sun sets, and then before you know it, it's back where it started again and it makes its journey again, and then round and round it goes, and we're just kind of there on this cosmic hamster wheel. The wind blows to the south and the north and never seems to achieve what it's supposed to achieve, and so it goes back and starts again. And verse 7, all streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Verse 8, all things are wearisome, more than man can say. It's the same meaningless repetition. Prisoners of time and space. In other words, the needle returns to the start of the song and we all sing along like before. Something that has come and something that will go. Verse 4, who are we? Who is this generation? We will come and go, but the earth will remain. We will be forgotten. Verse 8, the events of history are full of weariness. The great things that have happened, the great empires that have risen, the great wars that have happened, the great peace treaties that have happened, the monuments that are built, the great pieces of art, what are they? In the end, they're going to be forgotten. Today's news headlines are tomorrow's fish and chip wrappers. There's no remembrance. Verse 9, what has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Just doesn't even sound like the Bible, does it? But it is. And it's here for a reason. And when we come to a book of the Bible like this, we might be tempted just to skip over it because we can't quite make it fit. But maybe that's because we've got our understanding of God wrong. Maybe that's because we don't quite understand who God is. And the key to these first few verses, and the key to the whole book, is this repeated phrase that you might have seen coming up that says, under the sun. Under the sun. Everything is meaningless. Verse 3, it first appears there in verse 3. What do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? There's nothing new under the sun. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that there's nothing new in... If all we have is the materialistic world, it's futile and it means nothing. Solomon was the richest man who ever lived. He studied and experienced everything. In verse 13 of chapter 1, he says, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. And verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. When Solomon says in verse 13, I've set my mind to explore by wisdom all that is done, remember what we said before, that wisdom isn't just about an analytical understanding, an intellectual understanding like we might think it is today. What Solomon means is he set out to experience these things. If he wanted to study it, he needed to know the emotional side of it. He needed to throw himself into it. And we know that Solomon, in chapter 2, for example, he lived then a time of hedonism, life of a pleasure seeker. The editorial title here in the Church Bible, Pleasures Are Meaningless, at the beginning of chapter 2. I threw myself in, he says in verse 1 of chapter 2, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good, but that also proved to be meaningless. So Solomon lived this life of a pleasure seeker. He went and experienced all that was good, any thrill that his body could give him. Any new comedian in town, he went to watch. Any new wine he could drink, he drank it until he was drunk. Out with the lads, the parties, the houses, the palaces, the farms, the businesses. He was an international businessman of great renown. We know that he had several hundred concubines and several hundred wives, around 1,000 women. The most beautiful women in the world beat a path to his door like some kind of ancient version of the Lynx advert. And he didn't say no to any of them. And he looks at all of that life experience, all of that pleasure that the body can bring, and he says, meaningless, a puff of wind. Chapter 2, verses 10 to 11. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Solomon also became an exceptional teacher. He's described there. He describes himself as the teacher. And we're told that people would come from all over the world to gain his wisdom. He became an eminent scientist and an expert in literature and history. He became a brilliant psychologist, and we know that from one or two of the stories about King Solomon, don't we? The story of the baby, the stolen baby, and how King Solomon resolved the problem of the stolen baby. And that brilliant piece of psychology where he identified who the real mother was. And so he says at the end, pleasure and hard work and wisdom, it's all the same to me. You can be an absolute fool or you can be the wisest man in the world, and in the end, under the sun, it all means nothing. What about money? Chapter 5, verse 11. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owners except to feast their eyes on them? Solomon says the more money you get, the more people you get following you for your money. The more money you get, the more open hands you get following you. And probably that what goes with that, we know, don't we? Wealthy people know what goes with that. The less you can trust the people around you. The more you find yourself double guessing the motives of everyone who's ever nice to you. Is it just because I've got $1 million in the bank and they don't want me to fall out with them before I die? Even good and evil, Solomon says there's no difference. Here's a lady struggling with her shopping, struggling to cross the busy main road. What's the difference between the young man who sees her in her struggle and comes and helps her cross the road, and the man who sees her in her struggle and decides to nick her purse while she's distracted? What's the difference? Solomon says, good or evil, it doesn't matter. But as I said, the key to this is this phrase, under the sun. It means everything without God, life without God, is meaningless. More specifically, when I've experienced everything under the sun, when I've experienced everything this physical, materialistic world can give me, entertainment, sex, learning, luxury, poverty, wisdom, stupidity, when I analyse it all on its own, it means nothing. Life without God is just the breaking of wind. And this is the message that our culture's learning, isn't it? This is the message that our culture is singing about. This is the truth that our teenagers are responding to when they do violence to themselves and to other people on an alarmingly increasing scale. Everything that's listed in this journal of desperation in Ecclesiastes, this 3,000-year-old book, everything that's listed here are the things that our culture loves and idolizes. We've got sex all over the place. We're awash with money. Scientific discoveries and medical advances. I mean, how many of those have we made in recent years? Education, the number of well-educated people in the West is increasing all the time. But crucially, we've become this under-the-sun culture. We've excluded God from the whole thing. We've become so clever in our own minds and so self-sufficient that we've been able to say God is dead, and all that we have left is under the sun. We've killed off the idea of a God who is transcendent, a God who's made it all. John Lennon sang that one for us, didn't he? Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try, no hell below us, above us only sky. How did that kind of under-the-sun mentality help John Lennon? Well, his life became pretty tragic in the end, didn't it? At first he enjoyed the success, he enjoyed the money, but that didn't seem to lead him anywhere. It seemed to just go around in circles and become really increasingly frustrating for him. He had all the relationships he wanted, the hedonism. Because that didn't work, he got into smoking pot for his daily dose in life, but that stopped doing quite what he wanted. So he got into Eastern religion and meditation, became an outright atheist in the end, and wrote Imagine. And actually, if you read one or two of his biographies, you find that John Lennon in the end became obsessed with tarot cards. He became obsessed with the occult. It left him completely untrusting of all of life. Almost like he became a character out of Ecclesiastes. He wouldn't leave his New York flat unless his tarot cards told him it was safe to do so. Until one day he left his New York flat, presumably on the say-so of his tarot cards, and he was killed in the street, got shot. He is a man who sums up the modern culture, who sums up the idea God is dead. We don't need him. If he is alive, he's irrelevant. A belch in time and space. One of our more successful belches. We're discovering what Ecclesiastes has been telling us for a long time. When you concern yourself with the things that are present on this earth only, life means nothing. Life loses its satisfaction. And there are people who say, well, what we need to do about the breakdown in society is we need to bring back some discipline, and parents need to start smacking their children harder. That's the problem. And we need to reinstate military service. If some of these young men had some discipline and they had some military service, that would improve everything, and everything would get back to how we want it. But that's not the call of Ecclesiastes. That's not the call of the Bible. The call of the Bible is, as it says in Ecclesiastes, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Therefore, the vital job of the church, the vital work of the Christian, the vital work of the new creation, of those who are meeting Jesus and being saved and being restored to relationship with God, is to remind this world, above everything else, to remind our children, above everything else, there is God. And that is wonderful news. Because when you get to the end of trying to define your own happiness and trying to define your own morality, and you find it empty and bankrupt and void, the rising generation needs to know there is meaning and there is purpose. It's not found just in the physical and the material. When we teach children that they create their own meaning, that they create their own happiness, that they create their own rules, we're letting them down. When you take God out of the picture, breakdown begins to occur and life feels pointless. When you raise generations with the belief that they came from nothing and they will go to nothing with no good purpose, and all that they have is life under the sun for a brief moment, people grow up despising life and society crumbles. here is the good news. The Bible tells us that there is hope, that the world did not come about by accident, that there is a creator, that life is personal, he made it. What wonderful news then these words are at the very beginning of the Bible. In the beginning, God. That changes everything, doesn't it? Gives it all purpose, it gives it all meaning, it gives the decisions I make meaning. It gives the conversations I have purpose. It gives the decisions I make life. Life is personal, and that changes everything. There is a creator who isn't under the sun. He made it. The Bible tells us that life didn't come about by accident. We can look up at the stars at night and we're not supposed to simply say, isn't that wonderful? We're supposed to say, isn't he wonderful? Who made this? Who wrote this? Who came up with these colours? Who came up with this beauty? Who painted the sky tonight? When we see the wonderful sunsets that we get at this time of year. As the old bishop said, you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. And so we have this calling as a church, don't we? We have this calling as parents. We have this calling as neighbours to remind the world that there is God, that there is a maker, and that we were made to know him and we were made to live in relationship with him. Everything in this world is made to point to him. Everything that you and I have in our lives right now, every interest that we have, every desire that we have, in the end points us to eternity. If you love mathematics, then in the end you get to that point where you realise that even if you lived 100 lifetimes, you wouldn't know everything there was to know about mathematics. And you realise that it's pointing you to eternity. It's pointing you to something far bigger than itself. Or if you love human psychology and you love the science of the mind, or if you love languages, or if you love sport, you realise there's so much to know about these things, there's so much detail, and it all seems to connect to one great big whole, and it all seems to point to one great big creator who is out there and who is beyond. And if we don't do the job of pointing our neighbours and our friends and our families to the one who is beyond, then in the end all they have is what's described in Ecclesiastes, that desperation. And the Bible tells us, doesn't it, wonderfully, that this Creator God who there's something in us that wants to reject him. This Creator God that we've turned our back on as a culture and as a civilization largely. The God who made time and space, who stands outside of it. One day, there was a day when he climbed down the stairs of eternity and he entered into the back door of time, unseen, unknown, via the womb of an unmarried mother in a Palestinian cattle shed. The one who made the stars, born under the stars. That the one who was above the sun, who made the sun, came and made his home here. He looked up at the stars he had made as a creature, with his feet planted on the Palestinian dust, and looked up and saw the beauty of it like we do. And he lived a perfect life toward the Creator. He lived a life that reached beyond the sun, that reached beyond the endless cycle of nature and life and futility. And he died a death in our place. He died that death of frustration. He died that death of confusion. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then wonderfully he rose again to break the cycle, to break the desperation, to break the futility, to break the frustration. And one day he's coming back to redeem this entire creation. And what that means is that what we do suddenly is bursting with glory, isn't it? It's no longer got that frustration and that futility to it if we live toward him. That one day the King is coming back. And in this frustrated world that seems to be seemingly often lost in a maze of never quite making it, of never quite giving the satisfaction that we want, one day the King will return and we will know what life truly is. And we've got the privilege between now and then of working towards that, haven't we? It's what we're called to live for. It's what we're called to die for. C.S. Lewis said, "If I find within myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world." And that's the good news to a rising generation that's living with that frustration, isn't it? That even in the frustration and even in the desperation of a life in the book of Ecclesiastes, a life of meaninglessness, even that itch, even that frustration has got life about it, hasn't it? Because in that itch and in that frustration, in that desperation that people feel when life just becomes empty to them, God is calling them, isn't he? God is saying, come on, there's more to life than this. Don't you want to know the one who made it? Don't you want to know the one who made you? Don't you want to be living a life that reaches out beyond the stars? Don't you want to live a life that is walking into eternity? When our King returns, the elements will no longer be, we will no longer be subject to the elements in the way that we are now. Life will be as it should. Life will not be futile and restricting anymore. And best of all, the Lord will be with us. The dwelling of God will be with man. And so we have a vital and a wonderful message to share, don't we? In the way that we live our lives. Let's live our lives towards eternity. Let's live our lives towards the new creation. And may God be glorified.